Hello again, Year 6. We're continuing our journey through Private Peaceful today with our now reading. We're thinking today, rather than focusing solely on retrieval, although we do use some of the skills of retrieval in how we predict, we're thinking more about looking forward within a text and how we can make predictions. Now, as part of this process, when we're making predictions, we need to support our prediction with evidence from the text. Okay. So we can't just say, I think this, full stop, the end, no. We've got to think about what we know from the text. We're going to go through 3 or 4 pages together. So we're going to read until the end of page 23. So you don't need to read ahead of that. In fact, as part of the predictive element, it will kind of ruin it for you if you do read beyond page 23. We're going to look at vocabulary in each section. So again, if you can make some notes on these sections of vocabulary as well as we go through, and then we're going to make a couple of predictions at the end. So we're going to finish page 20. Sorry, we're going to finish page 20 off to begin with. We'll reread one passage and then carry on. In a way, our lives at home always revolved around Big Joe. How we thought about people depended largely on how they behaved with our big brother. It was quite simple, really. If people didn't like him or were an offhand or treated him as if he was stupid, then we didn't like them. Most people around us were used to him, but some would look the other way, or worse still, just pretend that he wasn't there. We hated that more than anything. Big Joe never seemed to mind, but we did on his behalf, like the day we blew raspberries at the Colonel. Earlier on, so yesterday, we looked at offhand. So when somebody's offhand, they're quite dismissive of somebody. They don't treat them with respect. They kind of don't care about them. They treat them like they don't matter. No one at home ever spoke well of the Colonel except Grandma Wolf, of course. We learn more through these little drop-ins about Grandma Wolf. She's not a character the narrator only thinks of. Whenever she came for her visit, she wouldn't hear a word against him. She and Father would have dreadful rows about him. We grew up thinking of him mostly as just a silly old fart. But the first time I saw for myself what the Colonel was really like was because of Big Joe. Okay, before we carry on, we're going to have a quick look at this piece of vocabulary work. Now here you've got a definition, you've got most of a sentence where this particular noun could be used, but you haven't got the noun. So the definition is a rank of officer in the Army and in the US Air Force above a lieutenant colonel and below a brigadier or brigadier general. So the usage is the somebody was in charge of a collection of unruly soldiers, it should say. And we've got the synonym of officer and the antonyms of private or junior. So what do you think that might be? Well done. Lots of you said it's colonel. Yes. So just an example there that sometimes we might be given an element of our understanding without the actual word that we're focusing on. But here, colonel is the word that we were looking for. Carrying on now through page 21, focus particularly on the sentence that says the Colonel trotted by as if he hadn't even seen us. See what we learn from the use of trotted there. One evening, Charlie and Big Joe and I were coming back home up the lane. We'd been fishing for brown trout in the brook. Big Joe had caught 3, tickled them to sleep in the shallows, and then scooped them out onto the bank before they knew what had happened. He was clever like that. It's a really interesting sentence that he was clever like that, because we know Joe struggles with certain things due to the illness he had when he was very young. But he's clever like that, shows an empathy that he has for certain things that other humans may not have. He was clever like that. It was almost as if he knew what the fish were thinking. He never liked killing them, though, and nor did I. Charlie had to do that. That relationship there between our narrator and Charlie. Charlie is relied upon when they go to school for the first day. Maybe Charlie's already been relied upon to look after the killing of the trouts, the sorting of the food. Big Joe always said hello loudly to everyone. It's how he was. So when the Colonel rode by that evening, Big Joe called out hello and proudly held up his trout to show him. The Colonel trotted by as if he hadn't even seen us. When he'd passed by, Charlie blew a noisy raspberry, and Mr. Spring would never do such a thing, after him. And Big Joe did the same because he liked rude noises. But the trouble was that Big Joe was enjoying himself so much blowing raspberries that he didn't stop. The Colonel reined in his horse and gave us a very nasty look. For a moment, I thought he was going to come after us. Luckily, he didn't, but he did crack his whip. "I'll teach you, you young ruffians," he roared. "I'll teach you." I've always thought that was the moment the Colonel began to hate us. But from then on, he was always determined, one way or another, to get his own back. We ran for all the way home. Okay. So here we'll just pause for a second. So the sentence we were looking at is the Colonel trotted by as if he hadn't even seen us, and the words trotted. So thinking about the number of syllables, how we break that word down, thinking about what we define trotted as. Now, it might be that you know that that's how animals move, so therefore if he's sat on horseback, he's trotting. But the way that this is described, as if he hadn't even seen us, shows something about how he's moving. Is he concentrating on other people, or is he just concentrating on how he looks? Does the Colonel show respect to the people he's passing? Or the fact that he's trotting by, does that show something about the disdain, the offhand way with which he treats Charlie, Tommy, and Big Joe? Have a think about that. Okay, try and complete the notes for that. For all the way home. Whenever anyone farts or blows raspberries, I always think of that meeting in the lane, of how Big Joe always laughs at rude noises, laughs like he'll never stop. I think too of the menacing look in the Colonel's eye and the crack of his whip, and how Big Joe blowing raspberries at him that evening may well have changed our lives forever. And I find that a really powerful sentence, just hanging on. Now, if I'm thinking of a predictive reader, why did it change their lives forever? What had one raspberry noise, one silly noise? Because, to be honest, all 30 of you, I'm sure, have made a raspberry noise. Secretly, I have. So, what does that mean? How did their life change forever? Straight away, as a reader, I'm conjuring up images of what might have happened, what might have caused this life to change forever. It was Big Joe, too, who got me into my first fight. There was a lot of fighting at school, but I was never much good at it and always seemed to end up getting a swollen lip or a bleeding ear. I learned soon enough that if you don't want to get hurt, you keep your head down and you don't answer back, particularly if the other fellow is bigger. But one day I discovered that sometimes you've got to stand up for yourself and fight for what's right, even when you don't want to. It was at playtime. Big Joe came up to school to see Charlie and me. He just stood and watched us from outside the school gate. He did that often when Charlie and I first went off to school together. I think he was finding it lonely at home without us. I ran over to him. He was breathless, bright-eyed with excitement. He had something to show me. He opened up his cupped hands just enough for me to be able to see. There was a slow worm curled up inside. I knew where he got it from, the churchyard, his favourite hunting ground. Whenever he went to put flowers on Father's grave, Big Joe would go off on his own. Just as we think of it here, we stop for a second. We think of that word menacing, that verb menacing, the menacing look, the menacing look. Sorry, the description is the look is not. It's not a perfect look. It's not a happy look. It's menacing. So think about breaking down that word. Sorry, not verb. That adjective, menacing. Have you ever heard of a character who's got the word menace in their name? If you think of somebody being described as a menace, are they a positive or a negative character? Okay, think about how menace might be used. Also, think about the context for how the Colonel was reacting with the whip and how he felt towards these people as they blew raspberry noises near him. Would he turn around with happy eyes, or would they be different types of eyes? Would those be negative look in his eyes? Think about the number of syllables. Think about how you might define that word. Try and complete these elements of that vocabulary. Well, then we'll carry on. Joe would go off on his own, hunting for more creatures to add to his collection. That's when he wasn't just standing there gazing up at the tower and singing oranges and lemons at the top of his voice and watching the swifts screaming around the church tower. Nobody seemed to make him happier than that. I knew Big Joe would put his slow worm in with all his other creatures. He kept them in boxes at the back of the woodshed at home. Lizards, hedgehogs, all sorts. I stroked his slow worm with my finger and said it was lovely, which it was. Then he wandered off, walking down the lane, humming his oranges and lemons as he went, gazing down in wonder at his beloved slow worm. I am watching him go when someone taps me hard on the shoulder, hard enough to hurt. It's big Jimmy Parsons. Charlie has often warned me about him, told me to keep out of his way. Who's got a loolie for a brother? says Jimmy Parsons, sneering at me. I couldn't believe what he said. Not at first. What did you say? Your brother's a loony. Off his head. Off his rocker. Nuts. Barmy. We'll just stop there. Before we carry on with thinking about what might happen as a result of this conversation with Jimmy Parsons, have a think if you can pull apart the word beloved. Okay, beloved. There's an element of it that's really obvious that shows how something is if it's beloved. Is it a negative or a positive adjective? Think about how you might describe something that you feel is beloved to you, okay, or something that somebody else treats as beloved.